Apostate Ashley here. Today I will be having a conversation with Dr. Donald Prothero about Kent Hovind. What are some of the things that he says that are false and why? Young Earth creationists believe the Earth and all its life forms were created by the Christian God between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago. They believe the Bible to be inerrant and take the accounts in Genesis as literal interpretations. I will be talking with Dr. Donald Prothero, a paleontologist, about the error of Kent Hovind's Young Earth Creationist arguments. Kent Hovind is a Young Earth Creationist as well as a cult leader that operates a ministry called Dinosaur Adventure Land in Lenox, Alabama. He shares his beliefs at his museum and on YouTube.
Today, did what I had to do, and this is enough for me. Never meant to be a winner, never meant to be a quitter, but this is how I lose satisfaction. Chip thrills, chip tricks. Woo! It seems like the way to live. Who said I should be a big shot? Who said I should take it, tick-tock?
Hey, Apostate Ashley here, your favorite ex-pastor, now atheist. I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Donald Prothero today. Donald Prothero has taught college geology and paleontology for over 40 years at Caltech, Columbia, Cal Poly Pomona, Occidental, Knox, Vassar, Glendale, Mount San Antonio, and Pierce Colleges. He earned his BA in geology and biology, highest honors, Phi Beta Kappa, College Award, from University of California, Riverside in 1976. And his MA in 1978, MPhil in 1979, and PhD in 1982 in geological sciences from Columbia University. He is the author of over 48 books, including 8 leading geology textbooks and several trade books, and over 360 scientific papers, mostly on the evolution of fossil mammals, especially rhinos, camels, and horses, and on the Earth's magnetic field changes to date fossil-bearing strata. He has been on the editorial boards of journals such as Geology, Paleobiology, Journal of Paleontology, and Skeptic magazine. He is a fellow of the Linnean Society of London, the Paleontological Society, and the Geological Society of America, and also received fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and National Science Foundation. He served as president of Pacific Section, SEPM, standing for Society for Sedimentary Geology, in 2012, and served for 5 years as program chair of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology. In 1991, he received the Charles Schuker Award for Outstanding Paleontologist under the age of 40. In 2013, he received the James Shea Award of the National Association of Geology Teachers for outstanding writing and editing the geosciences. In 2015, he received the Joseph T. Gregory Award for service to vertebrate paleontology. In 2016, he was named a Friend of Darwin by the National Center for Science Education. In 2023 to 2024, he was appointed a distinguished lecturer by the Paleontological Association. He has been featured on numerous TV documentaries, including Paleo World, Walking with Prehistoric Beasts, Prehistoric Monsters Revealed, Monster Quest, Prehistoric Predators, Entelodon, and Hyenodon, Conspiracy Road Trip, Creationism, as well as Jeopardy and Win Ben Stein's Money. Hi, Apostate Ashley here with Dr. Donald Prothero. We are going to be talking about Dr. Dino, Kent Hovind, who is very popular with his Young Earth Creationist arguments and his anti-evolution rhetoric, which I believe to be a facade that he hides behind to cover up some of the horrible things that he actually has going on in his ministry. I like to add those quotes in there because
To me, he is not legit in any of these things. He's not a doctor in any way, and it's not a legit ministry. His ministry hurts a lot of innocent people. So I would like to kind of go into what your thoughts are generically about him, but also maybe going into some of the specific arguments that he
Sure,
has
sure.
about the age of the earth and evolution not being true.
Yeah. Kent Hovind is one of the worst, as these creationist ministers, so-called ministers, are, because he's more transparently a con man and a swindler than some of the others. He's very much an exploiter of people who listen to him. And his basically his facade is one gigantic pile of lies upon one another, starting with his so-called calling himself Dr. Kent Hovind. Turns out his so-called doctorate is a thing purchased off the internet from a place called Patriot Bible College, which is that sells you fake doctorates. It was never earned at an actual institution of higher learning at any kind. You just pay for it, and nobody had to do anything other than just to exchange some money, and you get a doctorate. He supposedly had to submit some kind of a document to them to be a thesis, and that has actually been outed by WikiLeaks. And the people who looked at the WikiLeaks version of it found that it's basically a high school book report. His understanding of science is so thin that it's full of grotesque errors, which of course is the same thing he repeats in his ministry and his videos and all the rest. So it never passed muster in a real legitimate educational institution as a doctoral dissertation, and it was never reviewed by a committee. A committee of usually qualified PhDs are expected to finally review and approve your dissertation. And the only person who looked at it was the head of this Patriot Bible University, which is, again, the head of this particular diploma mill. So all his degrees are phony. The second aspect of Dr. Dino is he's phony as far as dinosaurs as well. He has no training whatsoever in paleontology, and he just says stuff based on what he's read, and of course makes big money off it, because dinosaurs are big business in this country now. Lots and lots of people, including lots of illegitimate swindlers, make their livings off pretending to be expert on dinosaurs. And that's one of the pet peeves of those of us who are professional vertebrate paleontologists like I am. And I've worked on dinosaurs and collected dinosaurs, although they're not my primary focus of most of my research, but I've done this. We have, legitimate people who really do have expertise in dinosaurs and have legitimate PhDs. And there are a very small number of them actually that really are considered top notch. Then there's a whole bunch of people that go around there basically marketing shows for elementary schools and youth groups that are about dinosaurs, but they themselves are not actually trained in paleontology to any great degree. They're self-taught, and they often call themselves doctor this or doctor that. But at least they're not pretending to be scientists when they aren't, and they don't produce any kind of pseudoscience. Hovind is even lower on the rung of the fakers, because what he thinks he knows about dinosaurs is about 60 years out of date. And if you look at the images of his Dinosaur Adventure Land, which is now in Alabama, it started in Florida and it's been bumped around because he's been in prison so long. They ended up, basically just, it's no more than these concrete statues you would see in any other cheesy roadside attraction dinosaurs, which date back from the 1930s or 40s, where the dinosaurs all drag their tails in the ground and they look like big scaly reptiles. And that's the way that Hovind describes them in his sermons and in his videos and all the rest. In fact, of course, since the mid-60s, and especially since the 70s, we have transformed our way of understanding how dinosaurs looked and behaved and so on. They're most of them warm-blooded. They're very active. None of them drag their tails on the ground. We know this for a fact, because when you see track marks of dinosaurs, there's never a tail drag mark between the tracks. And of course, many of them had trusses of these tendons that look like little bridge trusses all down the spine of their tail, which made their tail a rigid balancing beam. And they use this, of course, because most of those dinosaurs that have that are bipedal. They walk on two legs. And that includes T-Rex. That includes almost all the duck-billed dinosaurs. Their tails were held out more or less rigidly behind their body, served as a balancing beam because they were balancing on two legs. So that's one more aspect of his thing that's very out of date. Top of that, of course, the other thing that's come about, especially since the 90s, is the discovery that dinosaurs, almost all of them, had feathers. Almost certainly the dinosaur that people know from Jurassic Park is Velociraptor, which is actually the wrong size. Velociraptor is the size of turkey. The one in the movie is way too big. It's probably closer to a Utah raptor if you want to have a real dinosaur equivalent. But we've known since 96 that they had feathers. And of course, unfortunately, the movies, the first Jurassic Park movie came out in 93, did not render them that way. So they're very unwilling to put the feathers on Velociraptor that we know they're there. And so that's sort of ironic in a way, because Hovind's thinking goes back to pre-Jurassic Park world. Most people now in the 30 some years since Jurassic Park came out, have learned to accept dinosaurs as active with their tails sticking out and moving very fast and relatively intelligent, all of which is not reflected in the thinking that Dr. Dino has. So it's not only archaic and wrong from a paleontological perspective, it's not even culturally up to date. He's still doing dinosaurs that way they were in the 1940s and 50s. And then there's a lot of details you can go over. You know, he doesn't accept that birds are dinosaurs, which is now accepted by all scientists who know this stuff. He doesn't accept that, of course, these things are, you know, very different from any kind of creature we have today. There's cases where he talks about Triceratops just being a giant Jackson chameleon. Well, I owned a Jackson chameleon once. That's the kind that have 3 horns on their face. And that's all they have in common with Triceratops. Their skeletons are entirely lizard-like and chameleon-like and nothing like a dinosaur. No one who's ever looked at a bone would say that. He's just basing this on his crazy ideas and looking at pictures. And the list goes on and on. I won't try to completely demolish every silly point he makes, but the reality is his credentials are zero. His entire act is a fake. And basically, it's a con job. And this is sort of a con job we see more and more now in creationist circles. There are some creationists who just refuse to accept that fossils, especially dinosaurs, are real, because that shakes up their understanding of the way creation works and the way the universe works. But most of them, like Ken Ham in Kentucky and many of the others, have decided that dinosaurs are so popular you can't ignore them or dismiss them, so therefore you preempt them. And so then, of course, the famous creation research group in San Diego used to do that, and Ken Ham and his museums and his Ark Park in Kentucky does that. And of course, Dr. Dino, of course, knows you can't get around the fact dinosaurs are going to be accepted by the public, and kids are going to be especially interested in them. So you got to play it, go with it rather than fight it. So that's why so many of these dinosaur theme parks are actually run by creationists. There's one famous example of that here in Southern California, where I live, a place out near Palm Springs called Cabazon, where they have 2 gigantic concrete dinosaurs, a T-Rex and a sauropod that's supposed to be a brontosaur, I'm assuming. They're one on both of them are now hollow, and the one inside the sauropod's got a creation museum inside it. So they're like bait to suck people in if they stop to visit and they actually walk inside to get creationists. So this is something that's quite common. Creationists are becoming the biggest commercial purveyors of dinosaur parks in the country, not just Dr. Dino in Alabama. So anyway, so that's the long and short of Dr. Dino. If you want to look it up in detail, you look up under Rational Wiki online. You look up Kent Hovind, and the whole thing with all the sources is there about all of his false claims and so on. The most important thing, of course, is the guy is not only just a liar, he has been convicted and sent to prison, spent 9 years in prison from 2006 to 2015 for his lies of a different kind, that is lies to the government, attempt to avoid all taxes, which he does this because he's one of these crazy right-wing nuts who believes he's a sovereign citizen, doesn't have to pay taxes. So that's another story altogether, which we won't get to here because that's not my professional experience. You can ask an accountant or tax attorney on that if you'd like. So, all right. So you had some questions for me then, Ashley?
Well, as you were talking, one of the things that I believe that he speaks to is that humans and dinosaurs lived on the earth at the same time. I believe that's one of his arguments.
Very common. Most of the creationists will do that in order to make dinosaurs part of the Noah's Ark story, either that they didn't get on the Ark or somehow survived. In fact, there's no support for that whatsoever. The oldest members of our lineage, of the hominin lineage, to go back to maybe 6 or 7 million years old, or our genus is maybe 3 million years old, and our species is probably at the moment considered possibly 300,000 years old. The last non-bird dinosaur died 66 million years ago. So we're only off by about 60 million years plus or minus, right? There's no overlap. But of course, this is popular because going back to my generation, people learned paleontology from the Flintstones. They can't tell cartoons and reality. So they think of this as, all of prehistory is sort of crammed together in one time period in the Flintstones universe, where they have saber-toothed tigers, which also didn't live with dinosaurs alongside of dinosaurs.
Okay, so some of the other things that I have on here is obviously that abiogenesis can't be proven in a laboratory. That's something else that he has talked about.
Right. That's a very common way creationists, most creationist arguments boil down to you can't explain this, therefore God did it, which is not effectively a real argument. It's the argument we call God of the gaps. Science hasn't explained this, therefore God did it. And in fact, the reality is most of the things have been explained by science or nearly completely explained by science. If they have not yet been explained, it's not a problem. Science keeps making advances. If we don't explain it now, we just wait a little longer and then usually something comes along. In the case of abiogenesis, of course, they're talking about the idea of how you get life from non-life at the cellular level. And a tremendous amount has been done experimentally to do almost every step of the way, right? And we've identified how the earliest life was basically just a strand of RNA wrapped in a coat of lipids and with some proteins and so on. There are organisms today called ribozymes, which do both the function of being an RNA molecule, which is something that makes copies of itself, and they have proteins, so they're metabolically able to do stuff as well. So they're one step below a living organism because they actually make copies of themselves, which is one of the main things that life has to do to be considered life. It's not something that's going to happen easily in a test tube, but we have from the days of the Miller-Urey experiment in 1953, where they first showed how easy it was to make amino acids under early Earth conditions. Thousands and thousands of experiments, books and mountains of literature have been published with almost all the stages along the way. And I wrote about it at length in my evolution book.
Oh, yeah, okay. Sorry. I was going to say, I know a lot of creationists will dismiss that study that you're referring to from the 50s.
Right. They don't say that it wasn't know what they're talking about. Yeah, they just throw it away because they don't want to accept its conclusions, right? But it's actually an entire field of research with hundreds of researchers around the world who work on origins of life types of research, and they're mostly organic chemists and biochemists who do experiments in the lab because it's something you can't observe directly in the fossil record, but it doesn't need to be. We can find all the steps there, and we actually see the evidence in single cells that they were put together the way we talk about them. A good example of that is if you look at a more advanced cell, a eukaryotic cell that kind of has a membrane around its nucleus, they have inside them these organelles. The mitochondrion is one, of course, the energy producer in your cell. The mitochondrion has all the signatures of having been symbiotically absorbed from a purple non-sulfur bacterium because it has its own DNA and it has its own metabolic processes. And if you say hit it with an antibiotic, it'll die inside the cell. So it's basically an outside organism that was incorporated, now part of it. Likewise, the chloroplasts in all plant cells, they are basically cyanobacteria, blue-green bacteria. They have their own DNA, they have their own properties, and they can be killed off by use of antibiotics. So our whole cell has a signature of the pieces that were used to assemble it, and we can see those pieces running free in addition to those that are inside of a cell. This is something that's been established by the famous biologist Lynn Margulis way back in the 60s and 70s, that all cells basically are symbiotic combinations. And there's examples of transitional fossils there in form of cells that are sort of halfway there, where they still use a symbiotic organism as a free living organism rather than organelle to do the job that other cells have as organelles. So we can see these transitions all over. It's a long thing. I wrote a whole chapter about it in my evolution book. It's a long thing, all the steps chemically to do it, but it's not very far. We're at the point now where you have so much in the way of, things that are being done in the lab. They're just one step away from, letting life form in the lab. It'll happen someday, and then you'll hear it in the news.
Yeah, that'll be really cool. Because the study that you were referring to earlier showed that it is possible, but it wasn't an exact replica of what Earth's atmosphere would have been at the time, right?
Yeah, that's gone back and forth. The Miller-Urey experiment done in 1953 was actually just this little side experiment that Stanley Miller, who I met and got to know, did as a student of the famous Nobel Prize chemist Harold Urey at Chicago. And it was just to see what would happen if you took all the modern atmosphere out of a system, a closed system, and then put in just an atmosphere that's rich in nitrogen and ammonia plus other gas like CO2, but no oxygen, which is why we know the early atmosphere had no oxygen for a lot of reasons I don't have time for here. If you put that kind of atmosphere together and then started bubbling through it, this mixture of the gases, would they assemble themselves into more complicated organic molecules? Sure enough, you got 4 of the 20 amino acids that are found in every living cell in organisms, and just his first try. And now you may hear people criticizing, well, the atmosphere doesn't have that much ammonia and methane. That was popular criticism in the 60s. It's swung back the other way completely now, because we know, for example, one of the moons of Saturn, Titan, has a methane-rich atmosphere. It's actually orange because it's got so much methane. So it's very likely that the early Earth was likewise very rich in methane, and ammonia would have been common too. So we go back where we are in the Miller experiment. And the irony is it doesn't even have to happen just on Earth, because we have these meteorites that came from the earliest solar system. They're called carbonaceous chondrites. Many of them have amino acids in them as well, which tells us that there were places all over the solar system where amino acids are being assembled. And it doesn't even require to happen on Earth only. It could have happened elsewhere as well. Now, we don't necessarily think that those amino acids, the meteorites, were seeded the Earth, but there are people who argue it's possible that what happened.
That's interesting. I feel like I've heard that one before, where
Yeah,
it traveled to the Earth, and that's
panspermia, it's called. Yes, people argue about, since meteorites can carry these amino acids to Earth, maybe they could carry more complicated biomolecules and then start life on Earth. And you don't need that. I mean, we can make life on Earth work either way, and there's no way of knowing which one is true. It's just an additional complication of the hypothesis when we have all the pieces we need to assemble life on Earth the way we know it.
So it just goes without saying that it is most definitely possible that abiogenesis.
Creationists either don't know enough chemistry or don't bother to even read it. They just say, oh, well, it can't happen. They have no basis for arguing against it. Just ignorance is all they're going with.
So, okay. So I would like to maybe touch on a little bit of human evolution as well.
Okay. Sure.
You know, one of the things that we mentioned in our last conversation was you addressing that humans, or creationists say that humans didn't come from monkeys or apes because there are still monkeys and apes.
Right.
But
there's the misunderstanding of how evolution works. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of what I would like to touch on, is how Kent Hovind is incorrect about the evolution of humans and how they came to be.
Right.
Because he does like to touch on the fact that, you know, the soup, he always mentions soup, that we didn't come from primordial soup, and we didn't come from apes, and that it's all ridiculous. So what are your thoughts on that?
It's just all straight denialism. He has no idea what the science is at all, and he just mocks it by using simple straw man arguments like that. And first of all, yes, every form of life comes from the soup. We know this because the characteristics of your molecules can only have formed that way, and the fact that all life has exactly the same building blocks, and the kind of building blocks found in no other part of the solar system. We have chondritic meteorites that use other amino acids, but life only uses 20, and they're all left-handed. And the only way that works is if you all have a common ancestor that started with that blueprint, and then we built upon it. So if you don't like being from soup, that's tough luck. That's the way it works, okay? That's just because you don't feel good about it doesn't make you right. All right. And then likewise, there's misunderstanding about humans and apes, okay? I pointed out last time we interviewed that the way they're doing this is thinking of evolution as the march through time, from a monkey to a caveman to humans. That idea went out the door in 1859. Okay, life is not a chain. Life is not a ladder or a scale of evolution, the old way that was thought about since the days of Aristotle. Life is a bushy, branching history. And you branch off with descendants that live us alongside their ancestors. And again, the metaphor I like the best to sort of describe this is that when you were born, your father didn't die, and probably your grandfather was still alive, right? You live alongside people you're descended from. And that's the way all evolution works. It's a bunch of branching, bushy things. Now, what often happens, that kind of story is then grossly oversimplified for college and high school textbooks, so people can grasp the overall trend. But it doesn't change the fact that at the detail level, we're branching. So our branching history from primates is that 6 or 7 million years ago, and this is based on both molecular evidence and fossils now, we had a common ancestor with the common ancestors, the apes, not a specific ape, right? We did not descend from a chimpanzee or from a gorilla, even though we have 99% of our DNA the same. We are descended from that common ancestor, which we both share 6 to 7 million years ago in Africa. That's where it all happened. We know this from fossils. And then we have in Africa until very late all the evolution of humans, and we've gotten this from so many places in Africa now, especially Eastern African Rift Valley, where in Kenya, Tanzania, and Ethiopia, most of the major finds have been found because it's the geologically best set. trap them, preserve them. So that's the last 50 years of discovery since the days of Leakey, all pretty much focused in that region. But we have them from Chad, we have them from South Africa, we have a number of other places that aren't quite as geologically favorable, and we have an immense fossil record. Okay, and when I see the creationists try to do, they'll put together 2 or 3 old, outdated examples and talk about something that's been debunked 50 years ago, and then put it as if it's modern anthropology, which is pretty shoddy in itself. And I can go over example after example, but in my book on evolution, there's a whole chapter, and I try to show as many actual specimens as I can, because that's part of the problem. People just have only seen these simple diagrams or pictures of about things and never actually seen a real specimen. They're out there. The good ones, of course, mostly came from Africa, so they're still in African museums, but there are replicas all over the place, and there are lots of museums now, like in New York and Chicago and others. They have excellent exhibits on human evolution. So if there's not the original fossils there, they're exact replicas. And you can see every step of the way in the skull, and many of them have skeletons attached as well. And that's what we have. And there's thousands and thousands of those fossils. It's not like we just have 1 or 2 skulls. Just in Nairobi alone, they have a bomb-proof vault in the basement, which is called the hominid room, which has all the hominids found in Kenya. And they're, of course, under strict protection because they're creationists in Kenya who would like to destroy them. So anyway, that's a complete falsehood. Obviously, creationists can't understand or nor accept the idea that we are part of life. We're another organism, just like our 8 brothers and sisters, and we have to accept that. So they do all they can to distort it and lie about it, but they show no evidence of actually understanding what they're talking about.
I like that you mentioned how closely related we are percentage-wise to certain apes.
Right.
I recently had some creationists tell me that it was at the most 70%.
Nope.
And that there were creationist, young Earth creationist scientists that believed it to be 70%.
Well, yeah, they're not scientists then. No, you have to actually follow the scientific method, and you can't let your belief system bias your results. And so there's no such thing as a young Earth creationist scientist, because they already have their conclusions in mind, and anything they might try to do in the way of so-called research is just basically trying to justify what they've already concluded. Science is open-minded and open-ended. We're constantly making new discoveries, and we have to reject anything we don't like that is knocked down by more discoveries. We have to constantly move forward. We never know what the final conclusion is, and that's the way it works. And we can't just constantly do this thing where we say, okay, this is the truth I'm going to go for. Well, you're out of science the minute you say that. So this is, kind of thing. If you hear them say that, you just know that they aren't doing real science, because we have known since the late 1960s how close we are to chimpanzees. It started way back in the late 60s with the very first studies where they took blood serum from chimps and humans, and they would put them together in a common thing. And the more they locked together and the more they interacted, the more similar they are. They produce a stronger antibody-antigen reaction. That showed up in the way they could look at, say, other monkeys, and they didn't react as strongly as human and chimps did. And they could see a scale of how much closely related we are just by how strong the reaction is, because, of course, the DNA of your antibody system matches. And then in the 70s, we were able to sequence a whole bunch of amino acid sequences and other kinds of protein sequences. So that part sort of then further fleshed out the details of how close we are to chimps. And once again, virtually all of the protein sequences we share with chimps. But it wasn't until the end of the 90s and the early 2000s we finally sequenced the entire chimp and human DNA, right? 2001 was the year, of course, 2 labs independently sequenced human DNA. Chimp was a couple of years later. And there they had the real final clues that the entire DNA has been sequenced. And you have at least 99%, maybe 98.7% similarity in chimps. So at most 1 or 2% is all that differs. And that little 1 or 2% is like a giant sort of set of switches. It turns on and turns off genes that you don't even use most of the time. And so if you want to make humans go back to being chimp-like, you shut a certain switch off, or even more. If you want to say, come back to monkey-like characteristics that humans still have, you still have the genes for a tail, okay? And every once in a while, that gene regulation fails, and humans grow a tail. Okay, that's a well-documented thing. It's been done many times that's been documented.
Mhm.
Those genes didn't vanish just because you're not a monkey anymore. Okay, they just got shut down, and once in a while they reopen. And likewise, other genes that kind of difference from chimps will change, and we'll get a different kind of reaction. So that's why that tiny percent is hugely important, of course. But that's the critical thing. The percentage of similarity between us and chimps matches the fact that we are only 6 or 7 million years apart in time, and it's much more similar than any other two organisms on Earth. In fact, my good friend Jared Diamond at UCLA, he wrote a whole book called The Third Chimpanzee, which was built on this basic idea. And he points out that if you say took a bunch of alien biologists that came to Earth and didn't have time to sample humans and others and bring back whole bodies, they only had time to grab some cells and then go sequence them, they would say that humans are a third species chimpanzee, along with the bonobo and the pygmy chimp. Or the regular chimp, because those three are so similar. They're more similar than, say, lions and tigers are in DNA, which is about 95%.
Okay, so this is the book that Dr. Prothero is talking about.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate the plug. Yes, the whole point is I wrote that book specifically as a rebuttal to creationists like the late Duane Gish, who wrote a book called Evolution, the Fossils Say No. And that's been very offensive to me as a paleontologist to actually see the fossils and study the fossils that show evolution occurred. And so that book has at the beginning of it a detailed argument about the philosophical and the historical background to creationism and difference between science and religion and where the Bible comes from. All that stuff's in the beginning of the book. But then the entire last 2/3 of the book is all examples in the fossil record. And especially in this chapter on human evolution, I detail all the stuff we know coming from both molecular biology as well as from the fossil record. So basically, almost anything you hear a creationist say, I've already debunked it. And it's mostly older things that have been debunked a long time ago, because creationists are not scientists. They don't learn, right? They don't change. They just
Right.
keep repeating the same discredited, debunked lies over and over again because their audience isn't interested in checking this out, right? They don't care. They just want to be told what they want to hear. And so likewise, none of their audience ever asked Dr. Dino, where's his diploma? Right? It just took somebody who was not a creationist to dig up the fact it was a fake to discover that he's a fraud at every level.
And I'll say from experience, as somebody who grew up believing in young Earth creationism, this book is not too terribly hard to read, and it's very interesting too. It keeps my
Thank you. Thank you.
attention.
Well, I'm
So
glad.
it's definitely worth it for
Yeah.
sure.
I wrote it for people who are on the fence and not sure what to believe, not the hardcore creationists. They won't touch it with a 10-foot pole, but the people who have heard both sides, but not very well. And I
Yeah.
try to clarify that stuff. And I've had a huge response from people who's found this really helped them understand it and clarify it and make them no longer accepting creationism when they see how full of lies it is. So,
Yeah, because a lot of the time a lot of Christians are not intentionally trying to dismiss things that are true. It's just that they're indoctrinated and they don't
yeah.
really know any better. They've never heard anything else.
And when I was a kid in Presbyterian church at that age, I didn't know to look either. Of course, there wasn't any resources like there are now either. So, but now you
Yeah.
have no excuse. It's all on
Yep.
the internet. Even a kid can do it. Well,
Well,
thank you very much, Ashley. I had a great time. And as always, just let me know if you want to do another interview. So,
sounds good. Thank you.
all right. Bye bye.
Okay, bye.
When I wore my special shirt for the occasion, this is on my mini Darwin shirts. This is says Chucky D has a posse, and it looks like a wanted poster. So he's the cop, the good cop in this case.